Terrifying true encounter with machete-carrying thugs in the Los Padres Forest by Chalk and Shorty. In March of 2003, when I was 17, my younger brother and I took a weekend camping trip up to the Los Padres National Forest. We had gone there many times with our family for day camping, swimming, and just lounging around. This time, though, we went alone for a 2-night camping trip at our favourite spot that most of the locals simply call the Gorge. We will never forget this weekend for all the wrong reasons, though. We got there at Saturday morning at around 9 AM and hiked the 5 miles out to the Gorge. Now, the Gorge is a large swimming hole with a huge 60-foot cliff rock boulder that visitors love to jump from into the deep water below. The jumping rock cliff is very steep and one must be in a specific location below to ensure that they don't hit the rocks. The gorge has many primitive camping areas and is an overall beautiful yet isolated place. The first day was very fun, and after a long day of swimming, catching crawdads, jumping from the rocks and relaxing, we set up our tent and made a fire, ate our cans of spaghetti, and had a few of the crawdads that we had caught to eat for dinner. Towards the end of dinner, we were visited by a large group of students who were camping further down the river. They stated that they were students from the Bay Area who had a few nights left in their almost a week-long school camping trip. We offered them some of our chips and snacks and chatted to them a bit before they eventually made their hike back to their camping spot. It soon got dark and my brother and I got ready for bed. My brother was 2 years younger than I was and had a deep fear of isolation, so we had to sleep in the same tent and agreed that we would keep our fire burning the entirety of the night, simply to ease his anxiety. We put 5 large logs in the fire and crept inside our tents and got into our sleeping bags. We both fell asleep very fast as we were both exhausted from our activities during the day. Then, at around 2:30 in the morning, we were both awoken by a large splash of water near our tent that put out our fire. No voices though, and we also couldn't see much from inside our tent. We were frozen in fear. My brother began to cry and I tried to calm him down. I told him that I would go outside to investigate and that everything would be alright. I told him that our water bladder must have fell from the tree where we hung it from, and I'm sure it was some kind of coincidence, I told him. I then grabbed my flashlight, unzipped our tent and stepped outside. I pointed the flashlight over to the fire pit and saw 4 large men sitting around our fireplace, all staring back at me with what I can only describe as expressionless faces. It appeared as though they had slit our 2-gallon water bladder open that we had hanging over the tree and thrown it into the fire. I was in shock though. I didn't know what to say. For about 5 seconds, none of them said anything. We just stared at each other. Then, one of them said in a very drunk voice, "Get your friend out here." I then heard my hyperventilating brother scream and cry in our tent. He felt so helpless, and I did too. I had no weapons on me, and my brother and I were outnumbered 2-1. I asked them what they wanted, and they told me that we could leave, just that we were sorry if we had taken their camping spot or invaded their area. They ignored my question and just stood up. This is when I saw that 2 of the 4 men were holding something in their hands. Long sword-shaped in appearance, like a machete or a small sword, but they looked homemade and very primitive. The man yelled at us and asked us to bring ourselves over to them. I thought for a second that these might be drunk rangers getting mad at us for having too big of a fire. But once I glanced at their clothing and saw their baggy jean pants and their black and grey hoodie type clothing, I knew that we weren't that lucky. I had heard in the past that drug dealers or other dodgy people had been caught hiding large amounts of marijuana plants in the forest, and if these men were some of these men who somehow felt that we were a threat or to be cops, I knew that if this was true, we were in fear for our lives. The men did not touch us directly or threaten us with violence, but I definitely felt an implication to do whatever they wanted, and I felt threatened by the tone in their voice and believed that we had no choice in the matter. My brother, who was still crying, and I followed the lead male, while the other 3 men fell back behind us. My brother put his hand on my shoulder and was now visibly shaking. He then whispered to me that they were walking in the direction of the 60+ foot rock cliff. He then said that we needed to run. I was petrified and hadn't been paying any attention to where we were getting led to until I realised he was right. I stopped dead in my tracks and said to the men, "What are you going to do to us?" The lead male stated in a slurred voice, "Nothing. We're just going to have fun with you." I felt that we really had no choice but to do what they wanted and hoped that they were merely messing with us and that this would all be over soon. About 30 seconds of walking later, we arrived at the jumping spot on the top bounder overlooking the gorge swimming area. One of the men then stated, "Have you guys ever jumped from here?" I told them that yes, I had, but my brother had not, as it was still a pretty high jump and was very dangerous for most people due to the height and the rocks below. The men then laughed and again called my brother a wussy. I had told them that we were not, as I had jumped from this spot before, but it was not safe to do it in the dark. The men then formed a half circle around us, and one of the men said, I want to see. Show us that you're not a bunch of wussies." I screamed at them that it was far too dangerous to do in the night, and that during the day it was bad enough. I told them that there are many rocks that you have to avoid, because if you didn't jump correctly, they would kill you. I pleaded and pleaded, and the men just laughed and took a few steps closer to us. I was beyond scared and could hear my heart beating through my ears. My brother by this point was crying so loudly and saying things that I couldn't understand. He was beyond terrified, and so was I. I grabbed his hand and told him that we needed to get away from these men and we're in great danger. I told him that I had jumped off before into the water and knew where to jump, and told him that if he jumped with me he would be okay. I had told him I would use my flashlight to help guide us, and that I would tell him where to put his feet and how far to jump. The men laughed at us as we had our conversation and showed zero humility or pity. I held my brother's hand and placed his feet with my hand on a specific place on a rock ledge where I remembered jumping from the last time when I was here a few months ago. I told him that I knew he was scared, but we needed to jump as far out as possible and slightly to the right, otherwise we would hit the rocks. He was shaking and crying and kept telling me that he couldn't do it. He then urinated on the floor, and the men laughed and kept saying that they couldn't believe how scared we were. I then told my brother we needed to jump now and that he would be okay if he listens to me. I told him that after we jumped that we would swim to the shore on the right and would hide in the bushes until the daybreak, and then we would go from there. I then grabbed his hand tightly and told him that when we hit the water, he needed to tuck his legs and arms in so that they wouldn't get hurt from the impact. And I then instructed him that we needed to swim hard to the surface, as we'd be going pretty far in the water because of the height of where that we were jumping from. I then grabbed his hand and we jumped. I pulled him hard with me to ensure that he would be safe from the rocks below and that he jumped far enough. We fell for what felt like an eternity, though it was only a few seconds in reality. My brother yelled the whole way down in a way that I've never heard from another human before. Terror, dread, and the fear of immediate death reverberating from his voice. truly harrowing, as I felt helpless and almost forgot that for those few seconds we had to be careful how we hit. And then we hit the water. As soon as we hit, I lost a grip on my brother's hand, but I did hear a second impact in the water. I swam up towards the surface with all my energy and took a deep breath. I then listened out for my brother and heard nothing. I panicked and dove down into the water to try and grab him. Just as I dove, I felt his leg brush against my hand and realised that he was about to resurface. I swam up again and heard my brother. He was crying and kept saying that his arm hit a rock and that he couldn't feel it. The men above were laughing again, and I heard one of them say, "They made it. Those wussies made it." I then heard objects splashing in the water around us and realised that they were throwing beer bottles or rocks or some other hard objects at us. I grabbed my brother by his shirt and helped him swim to the nearby shore from memory of where it was. The whole time we swam, many objects landed dangerously close to us, and it felt like if any of those had actually hit us, it would have either killed us or caused great bodily harm, especially if we were hit in the head. My flashlight had been lost in the fall and we were in complete darkness now. We reached the water's edge and I pulled my brother to the shore. Objects were constantly raining down around us and we could hear the men yelling and laughing. I told my brother that we needed to run. He was crying and he was holding his injured arm that he still said that he couldn't feel or use. I had a deep cut around my elbow, and even with the starlight we could see that it was a serious injury. We stumbled down the tree line and began making our way through the darkness to one of the main trails whose location I remembered from past memory. We fell again and again and were cut by branches and rocks all over our bodies as we wandered about down the overgrown trail. Everything in my body told me that we needed to keep going and get as far away from these men as we could. We walked for many minutes until we could no longer hear the men and waited. I wrapped my brother's arm with my shirt and told him that it was over and that we would be alright now. All we had to do is wait until the morning for help. We sat in that spot all night and my brother's cries were continuous and shook for hours. I had just put my arm around him and patted his head as I did when we were children, whenever he had a panic attack and our parents were not around. At daybreak, we could finally see the severity of his injuries. He had a deep gash in his arm and shoulder, and it was obviously dislocated. I helped him hike up the nearby trail, and we walked all the way back to the base camp ranger station. We explained about what had happened to the rangers, and they sent 2 armed officers to go and investigate the location. My brother was sent to a nearby hospital for treatment, and I joined him on the ambulance over. The rangers/police never found the men, but did retrieve most of our gear. The scary thing about the incident? That's that 2 teenagers the same week were found dead at the bottom of the gorge jumping area, and their group had encountered a group of people before as we did in the same location, with similar objects like machetes that chased them down off their camping spot. I am glad to be alive, and my brother and I have never went camping again alone, or have never been back to that location and never will. All we have left from this incident are the scars on my brother's arm and a hospital bill, and a lot of trauma. I can only hope that their deaths were accidents and the authorities ruled this correctly. I did not find out about their deaths until 7 years later, but was horrified about the similar circumstances and timing of the 2 events. The Smoker in the Woods by the bringer of nachos. This story happened about 2 years ago while I was in university working on my degree in biology. I had signed up for a trip to gather samples for an experiment some students in the ecology department were going to run. It required the collection of samples from several sites, so they recruited biology, ecology and forestry majors to help them complete the sampling in a shorter period of time. The area that my group was to take samples from was a few hours from my uni in the Pacific Northwest. There are 9 of us in my group, 8 are students and there's a supervising professor. We got to the campsite in late evening and set up our tents. One of the other students had brought a big container of split pea soup from home and was sharing it with the others on the trip. I don't really care for split pea soup, so I decided to decline his offer. Everybody in the group decided to accept some, except for me, one other student and the professor. Coming the next morning, the 5 students who had actually ate the soup weren't in the best of shape. They were in the grips of some gnarly food poisoning and were in no shape for a hike whatsoever. The professor who was supervising us had originally set some rules, such as people travel in groups of at least 2 and that we had to be back to the camp by nightfall. Now, all of them rules were tossed out to make sure that we were able to collect all of the required samples. We were just told to do our best to complete the work assigned, as long as it's possible that we can do it safely. So, the following morning, I was set out for a long day of hiking. After a mile or so, I ran into the stream I was supposed to follow. I needed to travel about 4 miles up the stream, stopping every quarter mile to collect samples of water and soil. This meant I had to hustle to get back before dark. Halfway through the day I realised that it wasn't going to happen. About 2 miles into my hike, I stopped for lunch sitting on a log overlooking the stream. The scene was really peaceful, until I smelt cigarettes. It wasn't the smell of a cigarette being smoked, more the musty smell of a heavy smoker's car where cigarette butts had been left to just ferment for weeks on end. I decided to have a quick look round, but I couldn't see anyone. I just assumed that the wind had blown the scent of some hunter or hiker over to me, but minutes later it hadn't faded. The vegetation in the area wasn't that thick, but there were lots of places where somebody could have easily ducked behind a tree or bush. I was unnerved that someone was apparently staying close enough to me for me to be able to smell this for a long time without so much as a word coming out of them. I quickly packed up the trash from my lunch and continued up the stream. The musty cigarette smell went away for the next few hours. It wasn't until I arrived at my last sample location that I smelled it again. The woods were getting really dim by this point. Looking back on it, it was a really stupid idea to stay out so late, as just hiking back to the camp in the dark would be pretty dangerous, even without a cigarette smoking stalker. Having just put the collection tubes in my bag, I shined my flashlight around the darkness of the woods looking for whoever it was giving off this smell. I didn't see anything that caught my attention. It would actually be more accurate if I said that I saw too many things in the dim light that might have been a head sticking out from behind a tree, or somebody crouched in the low foliage. I didn't like the idea of being in the dark woods with a stranger who, for the second time, was lurking me without revealing their position, so I began to double time it back down the stream. I made much better time on my way back even though it was dark, because I didn't have to stop to take any samples. Even so, I didn't get back to the camp till a bit before 10. I was the last one to get back and everybody but the professor was already asleep. I didn't mention the cigarette smell to the professor because he seemed tired as it was, and he had headed to his bed in the RV as soon as I got back. So I headed straight to my tent soon after. I went to bed for a short while, but at some point in the night, I woke up needing to pee. I decided to head into the woods to do my business, as I knew some of the other students were feeling ill and needed the RV toilet for urgent matters, rather than just me needing a leak. I walked about 100 feet into the woods and found a tree that I was able to do what I needed. As I turned to go back, something caught my eye. Somewhere off in the woods there was a tiny red glow. I was confused as to what it could have been until it flared up my memory and I realised that it was a cherry of a cigarette. I stood there for a while watching the red ember glow fade, then move slightly closer to the ground as whoever was smoking would take it out of their mouth. Not being able to see the person, I assumed that they were watching the camp. I didn't know if they had seen me make my way into the woods or not, as the fire had been doused and the moon was only half full, so there wasn't very much light. I made my way back slowly to the camp as quietly as I could and entered the RV to wake up our professor. I told him about the person smoking in the woods and about the smell of cigarettes earlier that day. However, when we got outside the RV, the ember of the cigarette was gone. My professor woke the other student who hadn't come down with food poisoning and we took it in turns to watch over our camp. I didn't see anything or smell anything else when I was on guard duty and went to sleep when the professor woke up for his turn. In the morning, the professor, the other student and I went to where I guess the smoker had been standing the night before, and surely enough, we found about 10 cigarette butts on the ground next to the tree. The tree itself looked like somebody had been twisting and stabbing a knife or another sharp object into the branch, and we could see the outer layers of the wood where they had been damaged and chipped away, slowly going deeper into the tree. The professor decided that the group should head back that day, though we hadn't collected all the samples that we were assigned to, just so that we could be on the safe side. We packed up and drove down the thin dirt trail without incident. The second we got onto the paved highway though, a white van pulled out of a clearing just off the shoulder and began following us. This van stayed behind us the whole way back, pulling off the highway when we did, taking the same surface streets that we did. It only stopped following us as we turned onto the road leading to our university campus. Everybody was freaked out by this, but it was around 9 at night on a weekend, so the security office campus was closed. We decided to unload the RV and call it a night, as the van hadn't followed us onto the campus. I then offered the professor the catalogue and the collection tubes from our trip, so it was another couple of hours before I left the biological sciences building and started heading towards the dorm building that I lived in. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking. My professor, having left the building in the other direction to get his car, drove home. It was a couple of feet outside of the building that was now locked that I was hit with the smell of musty old cigarettes. I looked around and about 25 yards away in the darkness off the footpath, I saw the cherry glow of a cigarette smouldering away. I was pretty scared at this point, but hoped it was only a student or some guy staying out late having a smoke. I wasn't completely convinced myself, as the smell of the cigarettes was identical to the one that I had smelt the previous night in the woods. I started down the footpath, and as soon as I passed whoever was smoking, 100 feet or so later, I looked over my shoulder and saw the cigarette cherry bobbing up and down in the darkness. The smoker was now following me. This creeped me out a little bit more, but I held it together. This is until I rounded a small tree that I could then see a white van parked alongside it. I took off and sprinted towards my dorm building. I looked over my shoulder every few steps as I ran, and I saw the cherry of the cigarette fall onto the ground and a dark shape beginning to close in on me. I didn't look back again, but I could hear someone running off the grass and onto the path. I got to the entrance of my dorm building and I frantically waved my key in the front door so that the controller could be unlocked. As soon as I heard the soft beep, I opened the door, jumped through the doorway and shut it as quickly as possible. I stopped and peered through the glass door. I then saw a dark shape stop just short of the lit pathway. I watched for a minute or two, then I saw the spark of a lighter. The light is just barely bright enough to illuminate a shaggy beard and a brim of a baseball cap before it suddenly disappears as soon as it appeared and was replaced with the red glow of a cigarette. I turned and headed up the stairs to my dorm. By the time I get to my window overlooking the same yard I just ran, there is no trace of a dark figure or a cigarette cherry. Only in Canada by Chewbacca. This story comes from my father, born near Toronto, who grew up on a farm with a younger brother and an older sister. So this happened in 1969, while my dad was 8 or 9. One night, both my parents were out of the house, along with his brother. This left him and his sister alone. Eventually the phone rings and my father picks up with the standard Canadian politeness. "Hello, this is Bob." The person calling them says that they're coming to kill both my father and his sister and told them to leave the house. My father, slightly spooked, uses the intercom system to page his sister, telling her what happened. At this time, both the children could drive as they had been doing so on the farm, so leaving the house wasn't too much of a problem. While packing some things to leave, the phone rings again. My father answers it. "Hello, this is Bob." The voice then says, "Why haven't you left yet? I'm coming to kill you." My father then replies in a stereotypical Canadian accent, "Well, I'm trying to leave, but you keep on calling. I can't leave when I have to keep answering the phone, can I?" The voice then hangs up, and my father and his sister drive to where their parents are having dinner, and nothing else happened with that voice after that.
Kidnapped as a Child by Cheese Rice, 1996. It was a very long time ago, back in 1973. I know it was summer, I was 6, and we were living on Monica Lane in Madison, Wisconsin. Thing is, I sort of recalled it, but never put 2 and 2 together until a few months ago when I was talking to my mum, who went into great detail. I was a very courageous child, outgoing, extroverted, friends with anyone. It was at the time a middle-class neighbourhood, and 3 houses down from ours, on the same side of the street, was a huge park. My mum was a nurse, and my dad was a salesman, but my mum worked second shift at Merita, while my dad worked days. I rarely had a babysitter, only if they went out for dinner or a movie. But they did go out often, and there were always older kids in the neighbourhood to babysit. One sitter who I really liked lived a few blocks or so away, and down the street a little bit. Vicky had babysat a few times before that, and it was pretty uneventful. She would play games with me, and do my hair, play dress up, pretty basic stuff. So anyhow, one day I had gone with friends down to the park. I remember there was a ball field at the time, and a sandlot next to the field. My friends wanted to play on the monkey bars, but I wanted to play in the sand. I looked at the sandbox and my babysitter Vicky was standing there. I told my friends I was going down to the sandbox and ran off. We played in the sand, building a castle, and then she asked me if I wanted to go get something cold to drink. It was stifling hot. It was boiling hot, and I of course said yes. So she takes my hand and we start walking to her place. She starts telling me about her puppies and asking if I want to play with them. Of course I get giddy, and now I can't wait to get to her house. This was where my memory had stopped, and after my mum told me what happened, the rest of it flooded back. My mother just happened to be talking to my sister and I about some of the places we lived, and we got to Monica Lane. I told her I remembered the park and how big it seemed, and she asked me if I remember being kidnapped. I immediately thought she was kidding, and then the look on her face told me otherwise. She said it was around 5 in the afternoon, and one of my friends had come to the door to ask me to come back outside. Sure that I had gotten bored and walked back home. When my mum checked the house, she realised I wasn't there. 7 months pregnant with my sister, sprints to the park screaming my name. After asking several kids if they'd seen me with no clue, she went to the ball field and asked the older boys if they'd seen me. One of the boys, she guessed around 14, said that he'd seen a younger woman playing with a girl that fit my description in the sand and walked off in a general direction, and that was all he knew. My mum ran across the street to one of the houses and asked to use their phone and called the police. By the time the police got there, my dad had come home and some of the neighbours were trying to help my mum. So there's a little search party going out looking for me, screaming my name and knocking on doors. The police had gone back to the park to ask the boys if they knew who had been with me and if they knew who she was. Between the boys and the neighbours, they had deduced who it was that led me off, but I have no idea how, honestly. The police and the entourage go to her home. She lived with her parents, but they weren't home, and knock on the door. She came to the door and told them she hadn't seen me, and that she had been home all day. The police asked her to come in, and for some reason she said okay. They went through the house, and went to the basement and found me. That's what my mum knew, and then I remembered. It was literally like a floodgate had opened, and I started crying. At 6, you sort of trust everyone, and she'd been in our home. I never got a bad feeling from her, and my parents didn't either. But when we walked into her house, I remember that cold, holy fuck feeling washing over me, and getting very worried. I remember starting to cry and saying I wanted to go home, over and over. She takes me into her kitchen and gets me a glass of water and a tissue. I hear dogs barking, and next to the kitchen is an open stairway that goes down to where the barking is coming from. She starts trying to coax me into going downstairs, telling me there's all sorts of toys and games. I reluctantly agree, and she grabs my hand to head down the stairs. The dogs are going nuttier, and I start screaming. At this point, Vicky is getting fucking bizarre. She's screaming at me to shut the fuck up. If you don't shut up, I'll throw you in the cage with the dogs and they'll eat you. Shut up. Dragging me down the stairs, and I'm still screaming. I was scared out of my mind. I remember starting to cry so hard I was hyperventilating. And I'm screaming so hard I'm not making sounds. Vicky then flips like a switch and starts being syrupy sweet, trying to calm me down. She tells me that she was just playing a game and tells me she wants to play hide and seek. She must have been relatively skilled at calming me down, because the next thing I know, I hear knocking on the door upstairs, and I wasn't crying. The houses were all the same sort of tract houses, not huge but not small, but you could hear everything, any spot in the house. I keep hearing the knocking, and she tells me that it's her friends. They're coming up to play hide and seek. She convinced me to let her put a piece of masking tape over my mouth so I wouldn't make a sound, and lifted me into this big wooden box next to the kennel. She put a big pile of blankets on me and told me to be really quiet so they couldn't find me. The whole time the dogs were going batshit, but when she calmed me down, they calmed down too. They still looked incredibly mean, but they were no longer frothing at the mouth, and only slightly growling, until the knocking started. I remember scrunching in there, confused, still scared and convinced that the dogs were going to get out and eat me. I was crying again and hyperventilating. I remember taking the tape off my mouth because I couldn't breathe, but remembered I needed to be quiet because I was afraid what she would do if I screamed. I laid in that smelly box next to a big bag of dog food, sweating to hell, tears rolling down my face. I sort of pushed the blankets to the side, but only enough so that I could pull them over me when someone came. I recall thinking about my dad and wondering if he would come and find me. All of a sudden, I hear what sounds like adults yelling my name. They come down the stairs and the dogs are going batshit again. Over and over, men are yelling my name. I was in a large storage box, like a carpenter's toolbox type of thing, with tape hanging off my mouth. When they opened the lid, I remember a very nice man asking my name and if I was okay. I don't remember answering him in anything other than screams and tears, and grabbing his neck so hard my dad had to practically pry me off him. I remember my parents taking me to the hospital to be checked out, and that's all I really remember. My mum said that Vicky was found guilty of attempted kidnapping, and last she knew she was in prison, but couldn't remember when the last time was she heard anything. We moved from that area shortly thereafter, and I haven't been back there since. I do know that my mum said that her parents were odd, but they didn't know them. She had met Vicky from neighbours that had used her as a babysitter, and had never heard of anything bad, and that I always seemed happier with her. She lived in the general neighbourhood, but it would have been 2 blocks over and a block down. My mum said they never picked her up. She always walked over. When they'd get home, they'd drive to her home, but never noticed anything out of the ordinary. Mum and Dad had only met her parents when they came to the door to ask for forgiveness. That Vicky hadn't meant to do anything bad, and was a good girl. Mum said that my dad picked her dad up by the shirt and told him that if they ever came on our property again, that he would kill him. I remember her name and sort of what she looks like, but would have no idea if she walked up to me who she is. I think the dog breed is important, especially when you see it through a 6-year-old's eyes. They were huge Rottweilers, and to a child, they seemed like hellhounds. So, that's my story.
Thank God for Nurse Amelia, but don't let me be misunders. This happened to my mum in the early 80s in my native country. My mum gave birth to my sister and she was completely alone. She was a single mother and she had no one by her side, not even a friend or co-worker. Her family lived in a different state and she had to keep quiet about her pregnancy. My mum gave birth to a healthy baby girl in a public hospital. Almost immediately, a nun started shadowing my mum and eventually told my mum that a couple was interested in raising my sister if she was willing to give her up. Of course mum declined and told the nun to go away. That was in the morning, the same night, at around 1 AM. My mum's nurse, who was an older lady, wakes her up in a hurry and has my mum and my sister's bags packed. She told her, "Sweetheart, they're gonna take your baby. If you want to keep her, then you have to leave now. I'll bring her to you, but you have to go now. If you stay, she'll be gone by the morning." My mum got her stuff and left with my sister in the middle of the night, still in pain. Nurse Amelia was sweet enough to give my mum money for a cab she called in for her. My mum named my sister after Nurse Amelia. Had my mum have not escaped, then my sister would have been taken to an adoption place and probably bought by a rich couple who paid the doctors and the hospital money for healthy babies. I'm very thankful for Nurse Amelia for preventing this from happening and letting me have a sister. Casually brushed off being groomed by an older man, by a madman's dream. This happened about 6 or 7 years ago when I was around 13 years old and in school. Walking home one day, going through town, the weather was unbearable. Not like that nice sunny vibe that you get with summer warmth, but the horrible heat that blankets you and suffocates you. It's terrible. Anyway, I took off my school uniform that consisted of a heavy woolen blazer, long sleeved grey jumper and tie. This was mandatory living in Ireland and going to a grammar school. Heavy clothes like that seemed mandatory in the older schools in Ireland. So, with just a short sleeved shirt on, I headed on my merry way when this old man beckoned me to come across from the street. He was about 60 or 70 from memory, with a little driving cap and leather jacket on. Now this is something that has landed me in trouble before. I cannot simply turn down a conversation regardless of when the local junkies approach or clear red flag scenarios unfold. I always entertain them. I don't know why, and it's unintentional, but hey. So I walk over to this dude thinking, yeah, he just needs directions. The first thing he says though is, "Do you want some sweets?" He then instantly offered me some chocolate. When I reached out to take a piece of it, he just held my hand, like straight up staring into my eyes, holding my hand. He then rubbed it really slowly and asked me, "Would you like to come back to my house for a cup of tea? You must be tired and thirsty." Now, I know the sensible thing to do here would be to call an adult, seeing as there are hundreds around. But Belfast is a busy place. There are also police that often patrol the streets. All I had to do was shout out or make a scene. Instead, what come out of my mouth was, "Nah dude, that's kinda homo." Without any resistance, I released myself from his grip, took another piece of chocolate and walked back over to my bus stop, looking over my shoulder just to see that he was staring back at me with his mouth open, and after a few seconds, he hurried off around the corner. I realise now that the smart thing that I should have done is just reported him, seeing as this could have happened to anybody else my age and he may still be out there. Although the immediate danger wasn't there, I think the implications could have been terrible. I'm just lucky that I managed to escape from the situation with my health and chocolate. My Pitbull is a Hero by Clowny Critter. My husband began working overnights a few months ago, so this means my dog and I usually watch TV and sleep the night away before he gets home. Sometimes, I'll just draw all night while the dog is asleep at my feet, and when the weather is decent, I'll take her out for a jog, or I'll take her to my friend's house so we don't die of boredom. One night, while drawing some fan art for my favourite band, I decided to put my drawing pad down and go for a walk and get a soda for myself and maybe some peanut butter crackers for the dog. I got the dog ready and made sure my cat wasn't hiding by the door so she wouldn't dart outside when we left her. I then soon located her as snoozing on our couch. I remember this happening around late summer because our town likes to prepare for Halloween 2 months in advance. Pumpkins started to appear everywhere and my dog liked to try and stop and steal tiny pumpkins and cute displays from the local mum and pop-up stores. I couldn't count how many times I would have to apologise for my dog's rude behaviour, but that's not what's funny about this story. While jogging carelessly and dragging around my 60-pound Pitbull mix away from her beloved tiny pumpkin displays, a man across the street started yelling something that I couldn't make out at the time. Of course, I turned around and asked him what he said. We had a short and uneasy conversation that went like this. Yeah, what are you doing out here? It's kinda late. Me, just taking my dog out for a walk. Why? It was 9:30 by the way. He then replied, "Isn't the old man supposed to do that?" I then replied, wondering if I knew him. He'll be back from work when I get home." "Oh really? Does he always let you take the dog out this late?" After that, he then moves across the street and quickly wouldn't break eye contact with me. I then started to back away like I was ready to run. My 70-pound Pitbull started growling at him and snarling. Somehow my dog knew that something wasn't right at all. The man then snapped out of what he was doing and looked down to see my dog flashing her white teeth. My dog then lowered her head and started to stare at this man in the eyes. The man tried to laugh it off and took one more step forward. This sent my dog into a rage. My dog lunged and barked like she was going to rip his head off. I thank God I had grip on his leash, otherwise then he may have gone right at him. The man finally got the hint and turned back. He said something else I couldn't make out as he left. I don't want to know what he would have done, but I was just happy to have my dog with me that night. This Could Be Heaven by Innsmouth resident. In the Netherlands, we've got some quiet houses that are attached to one another. They're especially common in long streets. In the case of my parents' home, across the street were the exact same type of houses that were divided by a lane. If you look outside the window, you're looking straight at the opposite house is basically what I mean. It was my 11th birthday. Around 11 o'clock in the evening, the last guest had left our house and it was time for me to go to bed. Just before I got up, I saw the lights from across the house to ours going out one by one. I then saw Angeline, the woman living there, walking frantically around the house. She was somewhere in her 40s. She was your average housewife, though she lived completely by herself. And all of her blinds were open, so I could see her every move. There was one big window for the living room and two smaller ones above that. I could see her walking back and forth, up and down, for maybe 20 minutes. Then all of a sudden, the Queen's This Could Be Heaven started playing really loud, penetratingly. When it finished playing, it just looped over and over again. Then she come out, wearing not many clothes, and stood in the middle of the road. My parents decided to check on her and she did nothing. She only spoke in gibberish. In her left hand she had some tea lights. She lit them one by one and placed them on the road in a circle and lay down in the middle of it. By chance, a friend of the family drove down by with his shovel truck and stopped. She then got up and put one of the tea lights in the shovel and told him to run her over, saying it's time for me to die. He got out of the truck and pushed her in her house and closed the door. My parents were so shocked by this that they just stared outside. My mum then closed the blinds. I went to bed and pretty much immediately started having horrible nightmares. I dreamt about frightening orange illuminated figures in our blinds, skeletons and whatnot. I remember, however, that one night I was having one of these and I woke up and ran downstairs and sought some solace and comfort with my parents. I guess it was around midnight when my dad opened the blinds and there was Angela pressed up against our window, eyes wide open, looking straight at me. She was mouthing words that were so fast and frantic that I couldn't even decipher what she was talking about. Then an ambulance came out of nowhere and took her away. I guess somebody called an emergency number. I never saw her again, and I just beg for the sake of my heart that I don't have to meet her again.